Hey, this is Michael Lindsay from Vital MX, and we have a very special bike test today. We are out here at Fox Raceway. I'm wearing Fox gear, and I'm riding a bike by a rider who normally wears Fox gear. It is Ken Roczen's Progressive Insurance Ecstar Suzuki RM-Z450. This is his bike from the LA Coliseum race. We are out here the Monday morning after the race. They brought it straight here. Still has all the LA Coliseum dirt on it. The only thing they did is they pulled his Supercross suspension off of it that he ran at LA, and they put on his Chicagoland setting. So it's almost his outdoor setting, just a little bit stiffer, but really well appreciated, and an awesome opportunity for us to come out here and actually get a real feel for his bike. So we had about a 30-minute window early this morning to test the bike, got to look it all over, talk to the team. There's a lot to go over here, man. Starting out, yes, this is a private bike. You can basically buy everything on this if you want to go through all of the sources, all of the people they've gotten their components from. Maybe the most unique item is the Works Nissan front brake. If you really search, you might be able to hunt one down. Those are pretty hard to find. But other than that, this bike is basically, it's a private team. They are Suzuki's factory entry, but they don't really run any factory parts. Again, you can just go out and source everything. Starting with the engine package, everybody knows that this is a bike that Twisted Development works with. However, they built a base package. It's actually very heavily based off the old engine spec from when they helped out Davey Millsaps back at Rockstar Racing in the day. And this team basically has taken it and massaged it between their in-house engine guys, Dave Dye, Larry Brooks. They've put a lot of work into this. Starting off with that engine, the stock RM-Z450 has a very old school four-stroke feel. Has a lot of engine braking. It's a heavy engine character. It's very snappy, hard hitting, but it kind of revs quick, and it doesn't operate well at high RPMs. This engine is completely different on Kenny's bike. It is linear, it is smooth, it is nice and connected. And when I say connected, the stock bike's jerky. Just because it's responsive doesn't mean it's connected. It kind of lurches in corners. This one, little fine motions of the throttle. It's very responsive, but not like surging through the corners. It's very connected, very easy to ride. It completely feels different. That is by far one of the most impressive things about the bike, is how much they modernize the bottom to mid part of the engine character. However, there's only so much they can do. The bike still doesn't operate super well at high RPMs. It does kind of bind up. It still has some of that Suzuki character there that they can't get around. They have, again, boosted the power up there. They've boosted everywhere. But what they've done is they've drawn out the power. And they've changed a lot of that by changing the compression ratios. They've actually dropped it back down from the initial spec, and they've gotten the engine to not burn through the power as fast. It's got deep, long torque. They have some primary ratio options, some gearing options they play with to get that power to feel longer. But it's not really that the bike revs to the moon. They've just been able to draw out that power, make it much more linear and easy to ride. Compared to the stock bike out here, I appreciate their race engine 90% of the track. It is easier to ride. Any mere mortal would agree. There's only about maybe 10% of the time that the aggressiveness and response of the stock engine's a little bit better when you want to pop over something. But the engine character they have, that's rideable for 30-minute motos. That's very easy to use, very torquey, easier to clear obstacles, the whole 9 yards. It's also easier to actuate. The stock bike, there was a section where I was trying to get over this kind of off-camber roller where I'd feed it like 20% throttle, wait till I was over it, and then I'd feed it half throttle up to the jump phase because I didn't want it to rev out too quick, and then I'd give it the gas at the last second to clear the table. On their bike, I'm probably 40% throttle coming over the roller, doesn't really break loose, and then as soon as I'm over it, I'd go to 80, 85% throttle and just sit back into it, and it would just pull all the way up the jump face. Wouldn't rev out, just nice and deep in the torque, and I went from barely clearing the table while seat bouncing it to basically driving through the table and going to the transition by accident. So this, again, so much easier. It makes sense why their guys are able to do what they do. Another really impressive feature is what they've done with the chassis to get more comfort out of it without any real work trickery here. We don't have different swing arms to play with. We don't have a frame that's been gusseted anywhere. We don't even have different races in it. We're on a stock steering angle. Nothing's been done there. We have some different engine mounts, and we have something they've done with the triple clamps. So starting with the triple clamps, they look stock, because they kind of are. They're the stock clamps off an RM-Z250. The bottom clamp is very different on the 250. It sits lower on the fork tubes instead of higher, and it's different rigidity. The stock 451 feels very stiff when the fork's pushing back until it kind of lets go. The fork tends to pivot at a higher place in the tube, so the front kind of snaps back and it has a harsh character. So under braking, it loads until it tucks and kind of moves around really weird. With the 250 clamps being farther down on the tube, the front flexes at like a slower rate. Basically, the front end feels like it follows the ground better. It has a much more subdued feel. It's much more planted, and I can feel the contact patch at the front tire much better on these. Suspension's really interesting. Again, I'm on a Chicagoland suspension. That is KYB 250 components, where the rest is Supercross. He rode on Showa A kit. It's stock KYB 250 suspension that they've updated the valving in, and then instead of a spring fork cartridge, it has a PSF1 air cartridge put inside. I've always been a personal fan of the PSF1 air fork, so again, this is a very similar system to like what Star uses. Because the Suzuki has so much front weight, it's so stiff and rigid at the front, it plants the front end, it seems to work really good on the air fork, even outdoors, because the air fork normally has that crust feel. It's kind of dead, not as planted. It holds up a little bit higher in the stroke. The way the Suzuki acts on that, it pushes it down in the ground better, and combine that with the clamp feel. I had better front end traction and feeling on 250 clamps and air fork than I did on stock clamps for a 450 on the stock bike I rode today with stock forks, which was kind of trippy. So they've done a really good job there. Engine mounts, they have a top mount that they've shaved and cut themselves. Their bottom mount is from Works Chassis Lab. And that's really all they've been able to do. There's no room in the cases to do like offset collars or anything unique to change the engine position. So again, this is very close to the stock chassis, but the couple items they've done, they have completely transformed, in my opinion, the comfort level of this bike. I was super impressed between the engine character. Again, that plays a big part into why it's so rideable. What they've done with their suspension setup. I think any mere mortal would jump on this bike and enjoy it more than the stock 450. This is Kenny's race bike, yes. He runs his rear maybe a little stiffer than most and front end a little softer. It is very easy to ride. Easier to run into longer corners, I felt like was the biggest difference. The way it acts under lean angle, it's more stable. It's actually a little more subdued than the stock bike. The stock bike pivots in and turns really fast. This bike holds its line in longer ruts a little bit easier. Again, it's just more stable, a little bit slower responding, very stable. Talking about some of the things that are Kenny-esque about the bike. Controls. The stock Suzuki seat is very flat, low bars, feels like it's easy to move back and forth on. His has a little bit older school feel. The bars are a little wide, they're a little taller than I thought they'd be. You kind of feel like you're sat down more in the bike, and I've noticed Kenny sitting a little bit more squatted into the bike this year, and that's how I felt on it. I felt, again, a little more old school four-stroke-esque. I felt like I was in a pocket on the bike. It made me kind of feel like when you're a little kid and you're riding your dad's bike for the first time, you're just kind of down in that pocket. Very comfortable, easy to control, but a little bit unique. He runs his rear brake pedal super high. It kind of makes sense why he squats so deep under braking. That's kind of the only way you can control that rear brake, but it makes it really fun to roll into corner entry and mid corner being that far off the back of the bike. Again, I think since we've seen Kenny go back to the Suzuki, he's still very neutral on the bike, but he rides a little bit more back and squatted than he used to, and I can see why. Again, the bike suits the personality with all those little cockpit items. His front brake is super progressive and easy to use. It's not super touchy like some guys. It's not just like right there. It's very progressive, has a lot of power, but has a lot of modulation. A really interesting one that caught me off guard is the stock Suzukis, when you chop the throttle, they nose over really hard. Kenny's bike being a little taller in the rear or a little bit stiffer in the rear, I was thinking, man, how's this gonna work? When you chop throttle on his bike, it stays so much more neutral than the standard 450, and I couldn't quite wrap my head around what they were doing. So after talking to the team, Larry told me that their engine guy, Dai, had suggested earlier in the Supercross season to go to a slipper clutch, which instantly made sense. It helps the bike freewheel under decel so much, and honestly, that is one of the most massive improvements to this bike. You're able to chop the throttle even off high RPMs instead of having all this pitch and weight and engine braking character. The bike just kind of freely revs down and the bike stays very neutral. It doesn't get bound up by the engine like the stock one does. There's a lot of little accessory items I could go into this bike on. They just switched over to Honda hubs for Kenny. He does run Works tires, which does kind of change some of my comments a little bit about lean angle compared to production tires. There are a few unique items on the bike. If you want to learn more about that, read the article below on Put on Vital MX. I'm also going to put out an audio podcast on this so I can talk for 20 minutes because I basically could. But realistically, one of the only last standout things for them, the bike starts great when it's cold. It does not start great when it's hot. I feel bad for those guys. I now understand why. We've seen them kick it a few times this year. Yes, it's part of the engine spec. It's part of what they've done to it. It's not the easiest to start when it's warm. I stopped on track one time and it took me a while to get going. But at the end of the day, it's pretty impressive to ride a bike that, again, Ken Roczen has won Supercross on this year, has almost won in Super Motocross, was so competitive against the world's best. And I would take his race bike over the stock RM-Z450 every day of the week. Mine is a couple of little quirks with his controls. Change those out, and everything about this bike is better than the production bike, in my opinion. Really impressive. Hats off to the whole HEP Suzuki, PMG Suzuki crew for what they've done with this bike. It's extremely impressive, and I definitely understand a lot more of like why Kenny likes the situation he's in and the control that he has in this team. Again, these guys have done a fantastic job. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments section below. Again, could go on for hours. Check out some of the other content about this bike by hitting the links below. Thanks for watching. Give us a like, thumbs up, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.